They had a leadership center of human rights activists, liberals opposed to the succession of Mubarak's son, left Nasserites, revolutionary socialists, and eventually the secular-oriented youth, the youth wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. In the days of weeks of mobilization in Tahrir Square, neighborhood committees to defend the revolution were organized in many areas. And the self-organization in the square, as we all remember, thrilled even the most jaded Western reporters. In Tunisia, the students and the tiny far left were aided by local and regional centers of the massive UGTT, Union Federation. In Cairo, and especially Alexandria, militants by the unions were prominent. There's a general agreement that the reason the army held back from attacking Tahrir after the rebuff, militant rebuff of the paramilitaries on the Camel attack is because the Unionists showed up after that in greater numbers than ever before. In the midst of the occupation of Tahrir, workers in at least one of the textile towns, and I believe others, went on strike. And originally it was assumed that these strikes were economic, but later activists read statements that some of the unions had issued on that day. The iron and steel workers, for example, called for the immediate resignation of the president and all the men and symbols of the regime. They called for the confiscation of the funds and property of all symbols of the regime, resignation from government-sponsored, the right to resign from the government-sponsored union federations, and the establishment of an independent union. The confiscation of the public sector companies that had been sold out or privatized, and the nationalization of the public sector in the name of the people, and the formation of new managements by workers and technicians, the formation of workers' monitoring committees, General's Assembly of all the sectors to develop a constitution. Now, this union was not necessarily the average union, but clearly the political activity was permeating all sectors of the population, and the labor movement was beginning to respond politically. Now, a major turning point in the revolutionary process occurred after the square was cleared and the military assumed power, when activists broke into the security police offices and put all the files on all the activists up online. Soon it became clearer and clearer that to get rid of Mubarak, all the Mubarak symbols, meant opposing the managers of all the most state-run enterprises. Union after union has begun the process of trying to rid themselves of these elements of the regime. I believe we all watched the video, many of us at least, saw this very popular video of the insurance workers in one company streaming into the management offices, singing the Egyptian national anthem, leaving with the managers, the Mubarak appointed managers, on their shoulders. A whole process of purging the Mubarak remnants in many sectors of the economy and society has begun. It's interesting to think about this because of the nature of the regime, the separation of the fight for democracy, sovereignty, and the fight to control the economy has gotten a bit blurred. Egyptian capitalism, with its hands directly on control over the economy, as well as the relationship of imperialist investment in formerly owned state properties, means that the struggle for democratic rights is inevitably putting workers in the place of fighting around economic issues as well, economic and political issues as well. The revolutionary process is now continuing to undergo a further class polarization and a further differentiation of political forces. I think we're all thinking, I know, how can you not? Well, how long can this process go on without a decisive victory for one side or the other? As my co-panelist said, one side has to win. Taking state power, of course, is one of a number of decisive moments in the revolutionary struggle. But the process of the masses advancing and retreating, winning and losing battles, learning their strengths and weaknesses, making new solidarities with the women of Egypt, Muslims with Copts, learning learning their capacities is, of course, the heart of any revolutionary process. And it's good to remind ourselves that revolutions, that the Russian Revolution, which occurred was completed between February and October, was one of the shortest and rarest events in the history of revolutionary struggle. So I want to say that I think our place is to be optimistic. It's clear that the revolutionary contest is alive and well in Egypt today. Barack Obama knows it. That's why he's marshaling all his forces to prevent this contest being won by the working class organizations in Egypt. Workers' organizations lost the vote on a referendum for scheduling the September elections, a date that they thought favored only the bourgeois parties, and especially the Muslim Brotherhood. The military regime has banned strikes, and they've used military tribunals to try to hold back the revolutionary process, putting over 5,000 in jail. This has tended to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. Liberals who are happy with the removal of the figurehead and terrified by the prospect of continued workers' mobilizations are calling for their end and for cooperation with the military. Economists have been in the press calling for, quote, populism to be set aside. But others who don't really have an interest, don't see themselves as having an interest in the fate of Egyptian capital, have learned the painful way that the army is not the people's friend, and they're calling for international protests against the repression. The strike wave that began on February 6th continues. 40,000 teachers have gone on strike to demand the arrest of Mubarak, the impeachment of the education minister, more pay, and the right to join independent unions. In this issue of Socialist Action, there's a story, a reference to a story in Al Jazeera, and they're reporting on the scene at a courthouse where a couple thousand workers have gathered to demand that the court rule against, reverse the privatization of a state-owned industry. And Al Jazeera says, of course, the police moved in to try to hold back the shouting workers in front of the building. They said, but just as always commonly happens in Egypt, the strikers overwhelmed the police, and the demonstration continued. In response to the military repression, there have been the formation of dozens of liberal parties. There's the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood leading a populist but anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-working class movement. There are all kinds of challenges for those who want to see a socialist revolution in Egypt, a definitive end to the lack of democracy, imperialist intervention, and a society run without human needs. It seems that at least layers, important layers, leadership of the working class movement are starting to understand the scope of the tasks at hand. Some of the first indications we have is the formation of the Egyptian Federation of Independent Unions. A few days ago, I noticed in an Egyptian newspaper, they had a headline, a second union just forms an independent union. The technical work, several thousand technical workers formed an independent union. Seemingly in response to all this ferment, yesterday I saw, or I think it was yesterday, the main government union federation, the state union federation, announced that they were delaying elections to office until 2002, perhaps fearing that militants might capture seats. The same paper has reported that the formation of a whole range of workers' parties, which began with the strike wave of 2005, but was being stepped up. And this is, of course, despite the government ban on forming political parties on the basis of class. We know about one that was formed despite this ban, the Democratic Workers' Party, because the revolutionary socialist current in Egypt has played a role in bringing together first 100 key union leaders to assemble the first 1,000 union leaders that they hope will make this a viable party. We also read about a new socialist front, a revolutionary workers' coalition. And last week, well, earlier, several weeks ago, it was reported that there was a 5,000-person inaugural conference of the popular committees for the protection of the revolution, where the neighborhood committees that have been formed and functioning and developing over the past months consolidated their organization. It seems that every day the working people of Egypt are faced with more and more evidence that the interim military government is not the instrument that will bring justice to the criminals of the former dictatorship, nor the instrument that will really facilitate democratic elections. In a scenario described long ago by the Russian revolutionary leader Trotsky, it seems that the most powerful force for democracy in Egypt is its combative working class, and that the local capitalists fear these workers more than a continuation of Mubarak's regime without Mubarak. Trotsky saw over 100 years ago that the capitalist classes in the nation subordinate to imperialism had lost their revolutionary capacity. He believed and saw evidence that they were not constitutionally capable of leading the fight for self-determination or the fight to fulfill the democratic demands that were born of the great bourgeois revolutions of the past. Thus, Trotsky said, revolutions that begin in these nations over democratic demands having to do with agrarian reform, genuine democracy, anti-imperialism, will need to grow over into a socialist revolution if they are to be secured. This process he called permanent revolution. Should the working class of Egypt mature to the point of creating a revolutionary party and using all the instruments at its disposal in this process of differentiation and testing to appeal to all the classes who most need land reform, real democracy, freedom from arbitrary state violence, and basic democracy, they may capture the leadership of this momentous uprising and lead it to a decisive victory over those who still look to the IMF, the World Bank, those who will be standing with their hands outstretched for the new $1 billion Barack Obama will be raining down on important sectors, those they think will be allies in Egypt.
5 minutes.
Such a victory could put in power a socialist regime that would not only guarantee democratic rights, but open its arms to collaboration with the rest of the workers and peasants in the Middle East and North Africa as part of a process of breaking the imperialist stranglehold over the region. Because there's no sizable revolutionary party in Egypt today, there's no guarantee that such a scenario will unfold. Nevertheless, for the first time in a very long time, this is a possibility and something of momentous importance for workers the world over. It's this that the White House and the Pentagon understand and most fear. It's this prospect that has driven them to, on the one hand, support the brutal repression of the opposition forces in Bahrain and Yemen. It's this that's driven them to collaborate on a NATO military intervention in Libya. Because a military foothold in Libya not only places the US, the British, and the French in proximity to the oil concessions they all hope to keep from each other, but it places imperialism smack dab between the two most important revolutionary nations of the Arab Spring, each with strong working classes with histories of militant struggle and mobilization. There are those on the left who think the US is punishing Gaddafi for some anti-imperialist gestures he made decades ago. I don't think so. Gaddafi made his peace some time ago with imperialism. He gave up a nuclear program in return for a new cozy relationship with the US and for mutually beneficial oil concession arrangements. To keep up his end of the bargain, he faithfully accepted victims for rendition and agreed to police the flow of African immigrants to Europe. No, the US is not punishing Gaddafi for his anti-imperialism, but because they do not believe that his crude style of governance will be able to stem the tide of the youth and Democrats of the Arab Spring in Libya. And they know that there's some other guys from his regime that they thought would be better at it. At stake is a bulwark against the still churning tide of revolution in which Gaddafi's government is situated. I continue to hope that the people of Libya, who attempted to emulate the struggles in Egypt and Tunisia, will find a way to rescue their revolution.
And they have.